So I had this kid, we were going idle and about 60 degrees nose low, and we're above 10,000 feet. So we're hauling ass. And we were over some farmland in Nebraska. And from the back, I said, raise the nose a degree or two. Sir, raise the nose a degree or two. Why? We're supersonic. Why are you whispering? I don't want anyone to know. So no kidding. At least twice I can think of cross countries where we did an idle descent and the jet was supersonic and idle.
Spike, welcome back to 10th Century. It's great to see you.
You too, buddy.
So, viewers of the channel who are new may not be familiar with Spike because Spike, it's been a little while since you were on the channel. You came along, you did a fantastic episode for us, or two, around F4G in Desert Storm. You flew the Wild Weasel, and then you did a fantastic cockpit tour for us on the F4G as well. Did you do another episode? Have you done four or was it three? You did the OV10.
I did two on the F4, then I did the same thing on the OV10.
You did. So anybody who hasn't been around or wasn't around sort of maybe a year ago or so may not be familiar with Spike. But for everybody else, I'm sure you will be ecstatic that Spike is joining us once again on the channel. So today's order of ceremonies is going to be Spike's going to do a presentation on the T-38. But before we get into that, just a couple of quick announcements or public service addresses. You will, if you're in the UK, be familiar with React, the air show. I'm going to be there. I'll have a booth. I'll be selling some merch. Please, if you are going to React, stop by the booth. In order to find out more, go to 10thcentury.com. On the landing page, there's a little form. You can fill in your email address, hit send, and I will add you to the 10th Century newsletter list, and I'll be sending out updates as the time gets closer. That was it, actually. Just one announcement, one public service address. So Spike, tell us a little bit about T-38. Oh, before you do that, so I should say I did have a sneak preview of what's coming up because we tried to do this a week ago, and the sort of technical gremlins came into play, and between the two of us, we couldn't get the screen sharing and Zoom to cooperate, but we did eventually. In fact, that's not fair on Zoom because it wasn't a Zoom issue. I think it was a Windows issue. But we resolved it, and I got to see a little bit of what's coming up. I'm tremendously excited to see it. But I wanted to just ask if you would quickly give us your credentials, your bona fides as a T-38 driver, because I'm pretty sure when we talked a year and a half or so ago, you said you have 5,000 hours or thereabouts.
4,000.
Oh,
4,000.
Only 4,000.
Well, 4,100. Who's counting? Okay. I guess I am.
So does that make you the high time T-38 guy?
No, it doesn't.
No.
But anyway, to set up the intro, I started off as an OV10 pilot. Then after almost 3 years, then I went to the F4 and the F4G, flew that for 9 years. Flew the T-34 Charlie with the Navy on an exchange tour for 2 years. And then I finished up in the T-38 for another 15 years. And total military time, 7950. The high time is 4,100 in the 38, then 2,300 some in the F4, and then the rest.
That's quite an incredible accomplishment.
But there was a guy at my retirement ceremony that had 5,000 hours in the 38. And, it's unlike the F-16 where they have a page and it shows all the high time guys and that type of thing. There's nothing like that for the 38. But I would have to guess I'm probably one of the top 10 guys ever.
Well, I was going to say you're computer savvy, but actually between the two of us, I think we probably aren't. You could start a website to put your name on it.
Well, we'll see.
All right, let's get to it then. What have we got?
All right, let me hit the share button. Boink. And share. There we go. So today I'm going to talk about the 38, but I'm going to talk about its near twin sister, the F5. Which started as Northrop Project N-156. I want to talk about the history and the development, the changes that came along the way, some of the legends that surround the airplane. Some are true, some are not. And of course, there will be some flying stories. Now, if I can get this thing to advance. There's just a real nice shot of the 38. Early jets, because they loved to put a turbine warning stripe on the fuselage back in the day. It maybe does or does not have the additional cooling scoops on top, but a very slick airplane, no matter.
Let
All right,
me
so how did the 38 come about? And I got to get this bar out of the way. There we go. I hope you're not
Spike,
seeing.
while you're doing that, quick question. Just let me jump
Mhm.
in with a question already. Interrupt your flow. So those warning marks, are they there for the benefit of the ground crew then? So they don't stand
Anyone
directly.
that was on the outside in case the turbine came apart and came through the fuselage.
And that was a common occurrence or not?
I don't think so, but if you look at all the early jets in the 50s and 60s, they typically had a red stripe back in the turbine section like that.
Okay, I'll shut up.
All right. So, Air Force pilot training in the 1950s consisted of, as a primary trainer, the AT-6 Texan, just like in World War II. Briefly, the Air Force flew the T-34A, and then advanced training was in the T-33. So here's a picture of a couple of Texans. I'm almost certain that this is near Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. And the Texan was a good airplane. It was getting a little bit older and it's high gas and high maintenance for a radial engine. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to find a picture of an Air Force T-34A, but this is about the only one I can find. And it was a pretty good little airplane, but I think they decided it was a little underpowered. They also wanted to go towards an all-jet training experience, and the Cessna T-37 came along shortly after. Advanced training was in the T-33, the T-Bird, and I actually could have got a T-33 out of pilot training in 1984. They were still using them, like in this picture, for association with F-15 squadrons for intercept training. The problem was the generals that were running the Air Force in the 50s were enamored of high speed. And they had things on the drawing board such as this, the North American XF-108 Rapier, which was hoped to push towards Mach 3 as an interceptor. It never got built, but the fuselage and radar and avionics largely ended up in the A5 Vigilante. Here's another picture of it. So they wanted something fast. So around 55 or 56, I can't find the exact year, they issued a request for a proposal for a new supersonic trainer. And there were two contenders, Northrop and North American. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. North American proposed using two-seat F-100s. Well, that seems like a silly way to train a guy how to fly it in a fast jet because, well, it is a fighter. Their contention was, okay, it's going to burn more gas, but you already have the logistics train set up. You have spare parts, engines, everything you need. You have all the training systems set up. Everything's ready to go. There's a beautiful shot of one that used to fly. It may still be flying, I think, in Illinois, privately owned. The problem with the F-100 was fully 35% of all the F-100s ever built were lost in accidents. So that's probably not the best choice of airplane for your advanced trainer. Well, we ended up with the T-38, but surprisingly, Northrop started with this, the N-102 Fang. Well, what was that? Here's where it even gets funnier. So North American was proposing using the F-100. This man, Edgar Schmued, was the vice president at North American in 1939 and 1940, who is essentially responsible for the P-51 Mustang. Well, by 1955, he was working for Northrop. He had a different plan. He was in charge, and this man, Welko Gasich, was in charge of the N-102 program. The N-102 was supposed to be a carrier jet for short deck carriers called Jeep carriers. Other key names in the T-38 project were George Talley. I can't find pictures of these two guys, Leon Bagan and Joe Gluyas, but I believe those two guys actually laid out the lines of the airplane that made it such a beautiful airplane. So this was the N-102 Fang. And while books say that this is the origin of the T-38, I say, really? There's not a thing about it that looks like a T-38. First off, it's kind of a high wing Delta. It's got a F-16 style intake underneath. It's a pretty cool looking airplane, but it looks nothing like a T-38. But when you consider that this was on the drawing boards around 1952-53, that's a pretty advanced looking design for the time. All right. Well, apparently, one other thing I like to point out is this intake seems to have a lot of similarity with the intake that the XF-107 Ultra Sabre had, which apparently was quite advanced for its day. Cannon, some missiles that look an awful lot like Falcons. Here's Gasich in some Spanish publication next to the prototype F5, and I'm not sure who the other two guys are. So apparently the success of the T-38 and F5 program starts right here with the J-85 engine. According to an article I read in the Smithsonian magazine, back in the 50s, engineers for GE and Pratt and other companies were also the salesmen for their products. And they came to Northrop with a J-85. When the engineers at Northrop saw this, they asked, what scale is this model? And they said, this isn't a model, this is the real engine. And they got really excited and they scrapped the N-102 FANG program and started with what ended up becoming N-156. Here's another view of the complete engine with an afterburner. I forget the diameter, but it's kind of a mini J79 in overall principle. It's got variable stator vanes. It is a straight turbojet, but for its day, it was relatively light and had a high thrust to weight ratio. Well, here's what they were looking at when they started trying to come up with this naval short deck airplane. It was a high T-tail, very short coupled between the horizontal and the wing. Although if you look at the wing, it looks an awful lot like a T-38 today. This was the most surprising thing to me. Edgar Schmued wanted wing-mounted engines. And Gasich went head-to-head with him, and they had bitter arguments. He said, no, you can't make it fly the right way. All I can say is thank God that Gasich won, because if you were trying to teach engine out stuff in an airplane with the engines this far apart, that would have been a handful. It was bad enough when they were both in the fuselage. Once he convinced Edgar Schmued, let's go with the engines in the fuselage, well, it's starting to look a little bit more like a T-38. Although with this ventral fin back here, it must have been retractable or moved sideways or something, because there's no way you'd be able to rotate or flare for landing. Now we're really starting to look like an F5 or a T-38, at least from the wing forward. That's in October of '56. And here, again, from that Spanish publication, a mock-up from about right there forward, it looks an awful lot like a T-38. The tail was significantly different, and they found out or suspected they were going to have some flutter problems, and so they redesigned it. And here is, I believe, the rollout of the very first airplane. Things to note. At any UPT base today, you'll see the long pitot boom on the nose of the airplane. And look at this tiny little thing right here under the nose. We'll talk about why that got changed later. There's a couple of scoops back here on current airplanes that are missing for aft fuselage cooling. Here we see our two intrepid aviators sitting in the cockpit, but it was only when I was preparing this slideshow I noticed it doesn't look like there's any equipment installed in that cockpit. It appears they're just sitting on empty seats, and it's just a publicity shot of, hey, look at our cool airplane. But it is a gorgeous jet. Like I said, airplanes today have an extra cooling scoop on each side here to cool the aft engine bay. It's not there. Stuff they learned along the way.
Spike, can I ask you a question?
Of course.
Just while we're talking about the design. So there's obviously area rule going on here.
Yes, sir.
That was a thing. I don't know if you were going to talk about that, but that was obviously a thing that was coming through in the 50s. Could you, if you don't plan to later, could you talk a little bit about that now?
Okay. So Richard Whitcomb discovered area drag rule. And in its simplest terms, let me back up a slide here. If you pinch the fuselage in and make what was called a Coke bottle shape, back when Coke bottles were shaped that way, it reduces drag. I'll give you the layman's explanation. By giving a greater space for air to expand over the top of the wing, you don't have to have as much angle of attack on the bottom of the wing, and therefore it reduces drag. The very first F-102 had a straight-sided fuselage. It could barely go supersonic in a dive. They modified it, and the second prototype had area drag rule, and it went supersonic in a climb. So area drag really works. And Richard Whitcomb went on to make other discoveries, including the winglets that you see on almost every airliner today. But that was also his discovery. Mm-hmm. All right, next. If it'll advance. Come on, you. There we go. Other differences. This is the fuel dump mast. It's a vent. It's not a dump per se. That got changed, became much smaller. Here's a mock-up picture of the F5, and very different. Three-piece windscreen, and it has that swept tail before they decided that wasn't going to work. And then here's a mock-up looking much more like what we'd expect an F5 to look like. The first flight of the 38 was the 10th of April, 59. And I like to talk about this because you're going to see in a lot of pictures. For some reason, the rear canopy was painted over white. I've never found out why, but I suspect there's a picture you'll see in a minute about, I don't know, 8 or 10 airplanes at Edwards going through testing. I wondered if they had camera equipment set up there to record instrument readings as they tested it. And that was the only way to get rid of the light so that they could make a good film. Because there's no reason to have a painted over canopy for trying to teach a guy to fly. Here's another early T-38 pic. There's no cooling scoops on top. There's the turbine warning thing. And you can see it's got the white painted over rear canopy. That's also at Edwards. The San Bernardino Mountains. So this is east of the factory at Northrop, and a publicity shot from Northrop. They also had orange paint on the tails because they thought it was going to help with visibility. So talking about legends, early in the 38's life, it set a time to climb record to 30,000 feet. I don't know what the parameters were, but I suspect it was going as fast as it would go on the deck and then just a zoom climb. Because while it is a sprightly performer, the thrust to weight ratio is nothing like an F-15 or an F-16. And so if it was from a standing start, I doubt it would be any kind of a record. But unfortunately, I can't find those details. But it helped fuel this legend that, well, everyone called it the White Rocket. The airplanes are painted white, and they call it the White Rocket. Here's another picture of an early test bird. Again, the canopy painted over. Couldn't tell you why, but interesting. Here we go. This is the shot at Edwards, and every one of these jets has a white painted rear canopy and apparently some kind of a little window there for some unfortunate to look out of. And of course, the Northrop guy wearing, a white smock makes you look much more official when you're marshaling a guy in. The F-5A flew about 3 months after the 38 first flew. So notable differences. All right. The wing is much stronger. The last 2.5, 3 feet of the T-38 wing is only held on by the wing skin. The F-5, the spar goes all the way out to the tip. You could put a missile out there, an AIM-9, or a fuel tank. It's also got an inboard pylon and a centerline pylon that can carry a sizable load. Here's an early F-5 being chased by a 38 at Edwards. And this was an important design feature that Northrop I would say initiated, and it's become part of aircraft design practice to this day. They call this rear piece on the dolly the boat tail. And the whole idea was you could slide the boat tail off, the stabilators go with it, and you can do an engine change in an hour or an hour and a half because the engines are mounted on rails. They just unbolt several bolts, the engine slides back, put a cradle underneath, and it's out. To make that easier, the hydraulic pump and generator are mounted in a gearbox at the front end of the airplane, and there's just a drive shaft that comes off the engine and turns them. The only problem is if that little spline shaft breaks, now you've lost both the hydraulic pump and the generator. That will happen from time to time. For its day, the avionics were extremely accessible and way more accessible than an F4. For example, to change the battery in an F4, you had to remove the rear canopy and the rear ejection seat. And guys hated doing that for good reason. Early testing flight lineup at Edwards with 2 F5s and a bunch of 38s again with the white rear canopies. And I'm not an expert on it because I never did it, but I'm pretty sure that is a nuke shape right there. Did the F5s ever sit nuke alert? I don't think so. I think they're just, again, Northrop publicity shot. All right, funny story here. This is a Chevy Corvair. It was Chevrolet's answer to the Volkswagen Beetle in the 1960s in America, which was low cost back then and really eating into American car sales. There was a guy that wrote a book. His name was Ralph Nader, and he criticized the car, and the book was titled Unsafe at Any Speed. Well, we had a student, and he did a bunch of bonehead things in the air, and I named him Corvair. And he said, what does that mean? I said, you are unsafe at any speed. And so he said, what the hell is a Corvair? And when I searched the web for a picture of a Corvair, I said, oh my God, here's a Corvair in front of a T-38. It couldn't be any better than that. All right. Now, it doesn't end there. There were even more bizarre proposals. For example, Northrop was trying to sell a vertical takeoff and landing T-38 that had no less than, I think, 8 vertical lift engines plus 2 horizontal flight engines. Okay, it's easy to draw a picture like this, but I said, okay, where are you going to put the fuel? How are you going to control this thing? This is a chart that shows the number of engines and how long the fuselage has to be stretched. Yeah, pretty silly. They proposed, let's see if I can move this. They wanted to sell it to the Navy. And this is in this drawing, it's got the original swept tail. You got to ask yourself, in an airplane that used to take off at 160 knots, and now it takes off at 165, how would you actually operate that off of a carrier? That would be a little bit difficult. Also, I'm not sure if the captain of this aircraft carrier would be that happy that 2 guys just buzzed in front of his flight deck in fingertips. So, but it's kind of a cool painting. All right, how about this? Northrop proposed making a space trainer similar to the NF-104. So there were 3 NF-104s that were modified so that they had reaction control jets in the nose so that they could control the pitch and roll of the airplane when it was up in the thin air. The problem with this is, well, it wasn't going to have any engines at all. The intakes are completely faired over. So that means, well, how are you going to power this thing? How are you going to pressurize it? It was all batteries. If you look at this one, you can see it's got tiny little cockpit windows because, well, you're going to be in space. And it was going to be a vertical takeoff. So that was pretty ambitious, but never happened. There's a model of it. And it's got this big ventral strake. I don't know how they were going to deal with that for takeoff and landing. One more. There was a conference in 1948 at Key West, Florida. Air Force was brand new. And They wanted to establish the roles of each service branch. And at that Key West agreement, it was agreed that the Army would not fly combat aircraft. They could have helicopters and air ambulance, if you will, to evacuate wounded, and reconnaissance, and that the Air Force would do everything else. Well, the Army was getting a little bit frustrated with the Air Force in 1961, so they did a test with Fiat with the G91 and the F5 prototype and an A4 Skyhawk operating off grass fields. And I'm pretty sure this is across the street from where I live right now. Under the auspices of saying, well, this is for artillery adjustment and forward air control. It's the loophole in our Key West agreement. The A4, if you look closely, it's got twin main tires and an oversized nose tire. The F5 has oversized mains and a dual nose tire. And I sent you the YouTube link. I don't know if you watched it, of the F5 taking off and landing from this grass strip. It's pretty impressive. But eventually the Air Force put pressure on them and said, no, you can't do that. We fly the planes, you fly the helicopters. But there you have the F5 prototype in Army colors. One of my favorite pictures of the T-38, this is a jet out of Willie, which is where I went to pilot training. You know, there's an old saying that, you know, an airplane is a classic beauty when it can be 66 years old and still look sexy. And it still does. Another favorite view when you're in close trail and following the guy in over the top maneuvers. I showed this picture to highlight the differences from a T-38A and what is likely a T-38B. This is at Edwards. So when I went through pilot training, we learned in the A, and then if you were going to fighters, you went to Holloman, what was called lead-in fighter training at the time, and now is called Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals. The difference with the B model, it had a rudimentary manual gun sight, and it had a centerline pylon. This comes into play, unfortunately, in modifications to the C model. But we would actually carry a pod there, and with practice bombs, BDU-33s. You could shoot rockets. I never did it, rockets, but I did carry a 7.62 gun pod, and I have strafed in a T-38. You know what I hit? New Mexico. I expected this boom, 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 boom sound like you hear on TV and in the movies. Instead, I heard pop, 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 pop. And he's yelling, pull up, Jesus Christ. I said, sorry, I expected more. A nice shot of the original airplane and things I wondered about when I was a student. You can see that the red warning stripes have gone away. I always wondered about the shape of this intake. I thought, why is it such a bizarre shape? Well, it's actually angled downward for two reasons. One, if you're slow and at high angle of attack, and we practiced stalls and stall recoveries all the time, it means the air is flowing straight into the intake. It's the biggest possible intake when you're at high angle of attack. But also, since they designed this thing to try to go supersonic, which you could just barely do, at low angle of attack, now this becomes the smallest possible intake, and that's what you need in order to reduce the speed of the air mass that comes all the way back to the engine. For those that are curious, this is a fire access door so that if you're on fire on the ground, the fire department can shove a hose in there. Those are bleed air ports for, I used to know which stages. I think it's 7, 8, 9. And here, not many people know this. There, you can see a hinge on the back of the main gear door. Some of them have it, some of them don't. When the airplane first came out, there was a little hydraulic cylinder on the other side of the door. And when you retracted the gear, this thing deflected kind of like an aileron, and it aerodynamically helped push the gear up. Well, eventually they had so many hydraulic failures out here, they said, oh, the hell with it. Let's just put in a bigger hydraulic actuator to retract the gear. So I never saw the hydraulically actuated gear door ailerons, if you want to call it that, but they did exist at one time. Now these are C models at Randolph. A lot of people thought the C model was a great improvement. I differ. All right, it had some cool things. It's got a HUD, except I didn't like the HUD because you had to move your head around to see everything in the field of view. My biggest complaint, they made the intake bigger to get more thrust, which it did. Unfortunately, it also created more drag. So guys back here think that this nozzle ring, the turkey feathers as they would call it, well, that increases your thrust. No, it's actually there for streamlining to try to reduce the drag that this stupid intake caused. But the worst thing about the intake is it's straight up and down now, which means that when you are at high angle of attack, i.e. doing a stall recovery, and you pop it in blower, we'd get compressor stalls all the time, especially in the winter when the air mass was dense and literally the engine was making more thrust than the blades could hold, poof, and you get compressor stalls all the time. Classic shot of some early 38s at Columbus. All right, so they had them white, and there were two different paint schemes. White for basic pilot training, which actually worked really good for picking up your wingman in tactical for visual. There's another one. Well, and then they switched to the gray. Okay, back in the day, basic pilot training was white jets, and when you went to lead-in fighter training, they were blue, and they called them the Smurf jets after the cartoons that were these blue characters. Sometime around 1998, 99, they were trying to get a new contract to paint the airplanes, and it was going to cost too much to paint them. But somebody said, hey, we'll paint all the jets tactical gray and you'll get a better price. So the Air Force jumped on it. Well, they look cool. The problem was on a hazy day in Columbus, Mississippi, and your wingman in 1 mile tactical, sometimes it was almost impossible to see him. And it was really difficult to teach the students how to judge 4,000 feet, 5,000, 6, or 7. The white jets were easier. These pictures were taken by an old student of mine out on the perimeter road as he just watched some jets going around the pattern. Well, that's me, moments before I got my wings. And from the time that I started flying the 38 through the rest of my career with mom and dad, there's always been 38s out there. So NASA has flown them for years. I forget how many they got, 20 some. They were Air Force serial numbers, re-registered with civilian end numbers. So you can actually track them on radar tracking sites like FlightAware. This was probably not exactly an authorized maneuver, but it's a cool picture. The Thunderbirds flew them before I got in the Air Force due to the gas shortages of the 1970s. This is a C model, but it's painted in the retro Smurf color, which was a pretty cool concept. But this is an actual original AT-38B with its iron sight. You know, you adjusted the mil settings for what you needed. And you know what? They don't drop BDUs anymore in IFF. They just debrief it from the video after the flight. But I'll tell you, and anybody that did it old school like me, there's nothing like pulling off target, turning crosswind, and looking back for your smoke. And you either say yes, or you say, oh my God. That's instant feedback, buddy. Here's a picture of an F5. And I'm just showing the bomb pod, the BDUs we used to carry. The same thing could be done on the AT-38B. The one thing I wish the 38 could have had, a tail hook. And this little pouch right here under the tail is a counterweight. Why? Well, because you could carry the bomb pod, and the bombs could weigh close to 300 pounds up here. Well, that moved the CG forward. So you needed to have some lead in the tail so the CG was in the proper location. That comes into play here shortly. Here's a picture of a 38, I think at Vance in Oklahoma. And just a nice picture of around in the final turn. This looks like a Thunderbird T-38, but it's actually owned by Ross Perot Jr. He was an F-4 pilot. Of course, his dad was a multi-billionaire. It's a hybrid airplane that from here forward was a T-38, and from here back was an F-5. I was on a cross country. We were at Fort Worth. All of a sudden, I see this jet go screaming down the runway at about 50 feet and 400 knots. I said, what the hell? I said, the Thunderbirds still have a T-38? I was confused. He did a couple more passes and he lands. He's taxiing in. And right back here in the window, I see a little placard that said experimental. I said, okay, now I got to find out what's going on. So I go over to talk, and sure enough, it's Ross Perot Jr.'s jet. It's licensed as an experimental. Things that you can see that point out that this is not a T-38. Well, for one, it's got the centerline pylon. And this sloping area under the fuselage is the bigger speed brake and bigger gear well of an F-5. It's also got an F-5's tail hook and a drag chute. Nice airplane, but I don't know if he flies it much anymore. All right. So the T-38 and the F-5A and B, things that are similar, things that are different. All right. I guess I got to remember how I set up my slides here. Big difference on the F-5, it had leading edge flaps. Now this is an F-5B. The profile of the fuselage looks identical to a T-38. And the intake is a little bit different. Okay, it's got a tip tank, but this is an F-5B. It's also got, obviously, a big fuel tank hanging right there. The other notable difference on an F-5, the nose gear strut is a fork. It has a piece on both sides of the tires, but 38, it's only on one side. That's another one. Same deal. And another Canadian one. Norway, I think, or Sweden, I'm not sure. That's also an F-5B. Why? Because a 38 wouldn't have leading edge flaps. So for the F-5, they had pretty limited success with the A and the B model. They built 825 jets, but in 1970, there was a new export fighter request. There was also an uprated J-85 available, which nearly doubled the thrust. So Northrop put it in the airplane and revamped it and made the F-5E and F. To handle the increased thrust of the engine, there's some ox air doors behind the wing that open, I think, only when the gear is down. It actually has radar now, and they ended up building over 3,000 units, all built at Hawthorne, California. Now, this is interesting. I had always assumed that they were built at Northrop's big plant just south of Los Angeles International. And I figured, okay, they must have rolled them across the street to LAX to make their maiden flight. No, they were built in basically a rented hangar at Hawthorne. And that's a short runway. We were not allowed to fly on less than an 8,000-foot runway without some kind of special waiver. And I think we could only get waived down to 7,500 feet. I thought, how in God's name were they taking off brand new airplanes on a runway that wasn't even 5,000 feet long? The only answer I can come up with is they must have taken off with very little fuel, hopped over the mountains to, say, Palmdale, gassed them up, and then on their way to wherever they were going to go. But that's a really short runway for a T-38. Here's a nice shot of a Navy Aggressor F-5E at Fallon. Because of the longer nose, the cannons, and the radar, they put a bigger strake in there. It had two effects. One, it helped offset the forward CG, but two, it also generated a stronger vortex at the fuselage, which helped with lift. The Air Force operated F-5Es as aggressors for a long time after starting with T-38s that they were, well, frankly, beating the hell out of. Unfortunately, they did away with the aggressors, I think around 1990 in a cost-saving move. Swiss F-5s, and this shows one of the big advantages that the F-5E had. you can see the flaps are slightly extended on both jets in this picture. And so similar, I think, to an F-16 or any modern jet, somehow the flaps were moved for by aerodynamic loads so that it optimized the lift for such a tiny little wing that it could work a little bit better.
Did you have Spike? Did you have maneuvering flap in the T-38 then? Because the F5's got maneuvering
No,
flap.
no.
Okay.
So yeah, and I don't know if the maneuvering flap in the F5 was continuously variable or if they just put them down to a certain position and that's where they stayed locked.
Okay.
You could cheat with the T-38 if you went to aux flap. You could move it instead of one of three preset positions. You could put it in between positions. The only time I used that was I taught kids how to use that when flying in a radar pattern at a civilian field. And I said, don't fly at 300 knots. These guys can't fit you into their pattern. What do we do? Put the flaps down 40%. You can do 200. What? Yeah, it worked great. They still use T-38As as the aggressors for the F-22 squadrons, but that's kind of a mismatch, you know. Here's another Scandinavian F-5A, and you can see the drag chute housing right there. That's F-5E, probably out of Fallon. Swiss F-5Es with their demo team. And one of the contractor threat companies with an F-5E out at, I think, at Fallon.
Do you know, Spike, anything about so if you look at the Swiss F5s, I think it was a Swiss, I don't want to say invention, but it was a Swiss development. The slightly changed profile of the nose cone. It has sort of platypus type flat.
It's kind of flat. And
yeah.
I think most of the F5Es have that flat chine at the front of the nose. I honestly don't know if that's all of them or if it's just the Swiss airplanes, but it's definitely noticeable on the Swiss ones.
Yeah.
You want me to go back to that slide?
Well, I was curious to know if you knew anything about it. I'm guessing it's an aerodynamic thing. It's nothing to do with the performance of the radar.
I would think so. I mean, you can definitely see it in that picture, but I honestly don't know if that's unique to the Swiss or if it's everyone.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get it to advance. There we go. And then the ultimate development out of the F5 family, the F20. It was originally going to be called the F5G. And of course, they built three of them. It's got a GE404 from like a Hornet. I got to see one take off out of Willie when I was a student pilot. Everybody went outside to watch. And you know, it was a pretty capable airplane. But two Northrop test pilots, G, locked themselves while practicing for an air show and crashed, and that's why there's only one left. It's a shame. And since the Air Force wouldn't buy it, no foreign countries wanted to buy it because they figured spare parts were going to be too expensive. So it's a shame. Here's another picture of it. That was at Columbus. I was actually there when this happened. I wanted to be in this picture. I know some of the guys, most of the guys that are actually in this shot. This was around 1999 or 2000. All right, some Spike-isms. So I flew the thing forever, and I'm an engineer, and I when I don't understand why things work a certain way, I find out. And I would go to the maintenance hangar and talk to the guys and say, show me how this thing works. It was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot of stuff. So I'll talk about some handouts that I used to give the students, my fuel ladder, the electrical matrix, some formation stuff, landing picture, and departure picture. When I got to Randolph to go through T-38 IP training in 1999, I drew this up. So this drawing is, God, 25 years old. And it actually worked so good, I made copies and gave it to all my students. And it was a way to visualize all the maneuvers you do and how the G loading would change, what pitch to shoot for and when. The guys I gave it to said that it was very helpful. This is Spike's take on how to land the airplane. When I was a student, we were taught to land the way that the Edwards test pilots developed in 1961, which was you had to aim 500 feet short of the threshold. Why? Well, they lost a bunch of airplanes early on flying it, and they thought it was because the airspeed indicator must be bad. And so instead of that short little pitot tube that you saw in that rollout picture, they put that big old test boom. And then they added the AOA system, the indexer, which I loved. The problem wasn't the airplane, though. They were just flying downwind too close to the runway. Then they thought, guys are getting on the backside of the power curve. And so basically, they artificially raised final approach speed instead of the typical 10 or 15 knots above touchdown speed that most airplanes use. Final was flown at 25 knots above touchdown speed. Well, the problem there is if you got to lose 25 knots from where you're aiming until you touch down, that takes 1,000 to 1,200 feet from the time you go to idle. So what was initially taught was aim 500 feet short, then shift your aim point, and in that 1,000 to 1,200 foot distance, you'll eventually decrease enough speed that you'll touch down on speed. Well, unfortunately, somebody decided that made him uncomfortable around 2003, and they changed the books, and they told guys to aim at the threshold and somehow magically lose all that speed in 800 feet. And consequently, guys couldn't land either in the zone or on speed. So I showed guys the old school way. And guys, old students of mine that have gone to test pilot school have said they still teach it the right way at test pilot school, Spike. I said, I figured as much. When we got the HUD, guys were enamored of the flight path marker, which is this is where you're going. The thing I didn't like about the flight path marker is they had to damp it, and it lagged reality by almost a second. The other problem is you needed to set absolute aircraft pitch, not flight path marker pitch, to control the speed in the climb. So this shows once you lift off and you get 290 knots, you'd set 7 degrees of pitch on the absolute pitch, and there's 290, and you pull up. You would lead your pitch pull by the same number of degrees as knots. It was a pretty interesting concept. Somewhere around 7,000 feet, for some reason, the thrust always started to drop off, and you'd have to lower the nose a little. So I had this whole handout to show them how to do it, because the kids would set one pitch down here and get stinky fast. Then they'd set one pitch here and then get stupid slow, and they'd wonder why. I said, well, because you're climbing and the thrust is changing. Teaching aspect, or your relationship to the center line of the guy you're trying to rejoin on, the simple way was top of the tail lined up with the outboard wingtip. So a 30-degree aspect line, the top tip of the fin lined up perfectly with the outboard tip of the wing. And these other two show if you're forward or aft. The checklist had dozens of pages of, okay, if you have this problem electrical, take a look at this page. And I said, too many pages, too complicated. So this was Spike's one-page handout, and everything up here is on the left AC system. Everything here, oh wait, let me get rid of that. Everything here is on the right AC system. Everything here is left DC. Everything here is right DC, and that's on the battery bus. And guys said, wow, that makes it a lot easier to understand. I said, well, that's the whole idea.
Spike, your video is on, by the way. I can still see your screen. I can't see you. Just on the off chance it is recording us.
Okay, hang on.
Your video's gone.
Start video. There we go. I'm back.
Yeah, you're back.
All right. T-38A versus a C. This is an A model cockpit with one glaring exception. While the attitude indicator should look something like this, that's an F4 attitude indicator, because that's the kind that turns in heading as well as pitch and bank. So I'm not sure where this is or why it's got an F4 style attitude indicator in it. Here's the C model. And you say, oh, wow, how cool. Look, it's all clean and everything. Well, it is. But here was the problem. We had this INS now that took about 10 or 12 minutes to align. And you're fuel limited in a T-38. Basically, the fuel flow sitting on the ground and idle, 2 minutes on the ground costs you 1 minute in the air. I said, I want to spend as little time as possible on the ground in the chocks. And so what I started having guys do was hook up the external power so they could power up this box and program it, which took the kids forever initially. And then once this thing was all set and ready to go, I said, now you can start. I was the only guy that did that initially. I think almost everyone does now, but it was a pretty good system. I liked having the additional VHF radio. TCAS was really nice to help you find other airplanes, but I didn't like the HUD for two reasons, and you'll see a picture of it here in a minute. It had two pieces of glass and kind of a bezel in the middle, which kind of broke the screen. And you had to move your head around to see everything that was advertised. And the worst thing about it was the students would just stare through the HUD and they wouldn't look left or right. It's a video game generation. I call them vidiots. So I had this. When a guy wouldn't stop using the HUD, I would shut it off from the back seat. He said, sir, my HUD just failed. I said, I know, I shut it off. What am I going to do? I said, land it the way we did for 43 years. And I would say almost to a man, when I'd ask them in the debrief, well, what'd you think? They'd sheepishly say, it's a lot easier to fly with the HUD off. I said, good. Now you're becoming a pilot. He said, yeah, but if I fly with Major so-and-so, he's going to bitch at me. He said, okay, they say you have to fly with it on. Is there a regulation that says how bright it has to be? No, sir. I said, make it bright enough that he can tell that it's on, but dim enough that you can ignore it. I said, once you learn how to see the picture on your own, then you can look at the HUD and say, look at that. It says the same thing that I already knew myself. Perfect. All right, fun and games. This was on our way down to Miami. We sent, I think, 7 airplanes so that we'd have 4 jets to do the flyby ceremony for a Miami Dolphins game. Okay, that was kind of fun. So that's kind of some cool shots. There we are over the Everglades in holding, waiting to fly over the stadium. I was number 3. There we are, finished. Then they threw us in the back of police cars and dragged us to the game. We were down in the end zone watching the cheerleaders. Our squadron commander said, I'm going to see if I can get us in the owner's box. I thought, oh my God, we're going to get arrested. Well, he talked his way in. We were all in there. And well, when they found out that, Spike was there, there you go. I have no idea who they are, but that's in the owner's box. All right, another picture of a 38 just to show the traditional white scheme. And here's a Columbus jet. I don't know the actual tail number, but I must have flown this one in a special commemorative paint scheme. They put a new ejection seat in the airplane. And while it's a more capable seat, I didn't like it. For one thing, the old seat, the seat bottom was a stowage place. And so you put all your clothes inside the seat when you were cross country. You could also put your shoes on the floor underneath it. Well, Martin Baker said, oh, no, you can't do that. It voids the warranty. Well, now you had to carry a stinking travel pod, which limits you to 4 Gs, which cuts your range by about 10%. And yeah, I didn't like it. Plus, the new seat, the only way they could make it fit, it's 3 inches further forward than the old seat. And it's not like your car. You can't adjust the seat and put it back where you want it. So it just felt awkward compared to where you should have sat. The guys that have only flown this seat, they think that's normal, but I'm here to tell you the old seat was much more comfortable. Here's some aggressor 38s out of Langley. Oh, nope, out of Tyndall. An old student of mine, Ryan Bagby, went on, he flew A-10s, a weapons school graduate. And this is up, he was from Battle Creek, and we were on a cross country up there. Great guy. All right, some more stories. We're going to talk about flat tires, a Japanese student with a stuck throttle, a Saudi with a gearbox failure. Let's see. Flat tires. Let me see where I got to go here. Nope, we'll go back. The tires on the T-38, we had two different brands. Aviator, which was made by Goodrich, and Goodyear. And the Aviators were retreads. So they took an old worn out tire, put it in a form and added new rubber to it. You could maybe get 20, 22 landings out of them, and they were shot. The Goodyear ones, 38, 40. I could usually get about 42 to 44 because I'd get the students to fully flare the thing. You're going to see some pictures here shortly. Let's see, how are we going to do this? We'll go to the next slide. This shows our in-flight guide for Columbus and the airspace that we typically worked in. Some frequency card stuff. I guess I got to come back to my stories. Damn it. I gotta remember how I got this organized. Sorry. The flight commander, Bullseye, picked up this job where he was a advon for Air Force One, which they'd send him and another guy out to some place that Air Force One was going to go. They'd survey the airport for security, for fuel, all that kind of stuff. It was a way to get promoted. So he was gone for a week, and I was the only instructor in our flight. And I flew 15 times, 3 times a day, 5 days in a row. So I said, well, I'm the flight commander, the assistant flight commander, the scheduler, the IP. I'm everybody. When I came back, he came back with this bottle. This is the booze they serve on Air Force One. You can see the presidential seal engraved on the back. And he had an F4 and a 38 added, engraved, and my name on it. So
nice.
That was pretty cool. Cross country, I was in the reserves in the 43rd Flying Training Squadron. We saw this car in a parking lot, so just had to take a silly picture. Used to go cross country or out and back with students where we take them out on one leg to an unfamiliar airport, get lunch, and then come back. So I like to take kids to Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. And when we'd check them with approach, we'd ask for the arch tour. And you can see it right there. There's the St. Louis Arch along the river. They'd say, Roger, stay 1,500 feet, stay on the east side of the river, and report when you're done. And yeah, the students thought that was pretty cool. Spouse Taxi Day. So at the end of the fiscal year, which is September, if we were basically done flying, they'd have Spouse Taxi Day. And so they'd get 4 wives and put them in the back seat and make them talk on the radio, wearing the G suit and the parachute and everything. And, you know, whoever was lead would say, powder puff check. What do I do now? Let go of the button. Anyway, it was always fun. So we'd take them out on the runway, and the Air Force said, if you fly, you will never fly again. So the airplanes only had about 1,000 pounds of gas in them. They didn't even take the downlock pins off the gear, but we'd close the canopies, you'd put it in blower, take them up to 100 knots, and then stop. And they thought that was the coolest thing ever. So this was around 2000. My wife got to do that, and she thought that was a blast. All right, this is a great story. So I can't remember what year. Well, hell, I should look at the class number. I can't read it. The new class comes in. They're all excited because they made the cut to get to T-38s, and only about 25 to 30% of the students were coming to the 38. This means they've got a shot at a fighter. So they're milling around in the room and getting their stuff ready. And one of them, his last name was Temple. And I'm sitting at my desk going, Temple? I said, you wouldn't know Kurt Temple, would you? And he turned around and went, ah. He said, sir, he's my, and I cut him off, said, father. I said, oh my God, I'm teaching the son of a guy I was in ROTC with. Well, Temple was my student. He ended up being the top stick of his class. And it's a tradition that when you solo a kid out, he's supposed to buy you whatever alcohol you want. And so they'd ask me, sir, what do you want to drink? And I'd say, I'll tone it down a little. Say, well, my wife says that dark rum makes her frisky. So I'm pretty sure I want dark rum. So I tell Temple this. A couple weeks go by. I said, Temple, where's my bottle? He said, I'm working on it. And I thought, how do you work on it? You just go to the store and buy one. A month goes by. I said, Temple, Mama needs persuasion. And he said, there was a problem. Okay, so I basically gave up. It's almost graduation time now. I come down from a flight one afternoon, and Temple's standing at attention at my desk, and I see a cardboard box on my desk. He said, sir, your bottle came in. I thought, oh no, he must have spent hundreds of dollars on some rare and exotic rum. Well, what he had done, he took a bottle and sent it off and had it engraved, and then the engraving is painted. So it's got an F4 leading 3 T-38s. It's got his class patch. And then I was the oldest instructor on base by a wide, wide margin. And so down here, it says, some shit just gets better with age. And when my fellow IPs saw this, they said, dude, they said, the bar is so high, it'll never be exceeded. You got that right. It's an awesome gift. And I've never opened it. When he graduated from weapons school, I went. And if I hadn't had an airline trip the next day, I would have brought it and we would have drank it. But it's still sitting here on my shelf. That's a typical graduation class at the formal dinner. That's Bullseye that gave me that one bottle. I'm going to talk about Musa, I think, here in a little bit. That's Hopper Duhan, who saved his entire crew in a B-1 when the seats wouldn't eject. All great people. A lot of fun. That's a reserve cross country in Huntsville. Here's my ugly mug. All right, this is a funny story. A student found this, I think it was Mike Koob, and I think it was him because his sister worked in the Library of Congress. It's a letter from Hap Arnold to a General Krogstad in 1939. And it's basically, it said he's addressing the chief of the Air Corps is concerned that senior and older pilots take no unnecessary flying risks. And he goes on to say that if you're older than 47, we request that you only fly with an instructor pilot. Well, when he gave me this letter, I was already in my 50s. So I thought, this is hilarious. I had this thing hanging on my wall at my desk. Other fun. I was in a band with some guys there. I wanted to call us the Stone Temple Instructor Pilots, but yeah, they'd already settled on the name Rocktopus before I joined the band, but that was a lot of fun. We played a number of assignment nights and graduation parties. There's Opie on guitar, me on guitar, and on bass. All right, so this, I'm with another IP, and I can't remember his name, Nick something. But we were flying to Alexandria, Louisiana, which used to be England Air Force Base. And as I'm flying the jet right now in the back seat, and Nick says, hey, there's a guy down there on the perimeter road taking our pictures. So he waves. There's Nick. And so I met my friend Matt Ellis, who does aviation photography as a hobby. And a lot of the cool pictures that you'll see here were taken by Matt. This is across country with the reserves where we went to Buckley for reserve training, but really it was a ski weekend. That's why the travel pods are there. Guys had their skis in there. Matt took this picture at Alexandria as my student Matt Carver and I were getting ready for a night sortie, and it's one of my favorites. That is just such a cool picture.
Yeah.
Also at Alexandria, probably the same day or night. All right, so I'm going to get some stories. Bird strike. I took off to fly a low level on this green run, and the low level would have run around this way, up here, back down this way, and then home. I'm flying with Joe Palin, and we've just started the route. And I'm looking back at our 8 o'clock for a tower that I was trying to find that was a timing mark. And I heard wham. And I said, what the hell was that? He said, I don't know, sir. I said, I got the jet. And I said, shit, we must have hit a bird. And when we looked at the tape afterward, you could see it. The bird was flying across our nose, saw us coming, turned around and came back. If he'd have kept going the same way, he could have been clear, but he went down the left intake and trashed the engine. So we had a lot of gas. I left engine compressor stalled. I put it in idle and it recovered. I thought, well, I'll just pop the other engine and burner and we'll get on home and burn up some of this gas. And Joe said, man, when I saw both those engines roll back, I said, what? Because I thought, and I was just about to pop it in burner. I thought, oh crap. If something went down both engines, if I put it in blower, this thing, they may both cough. So we came back at over 400 knots with one engine in mill and one in idle and came back and landed. And so it made him a little nervous. And I still have the tape. And they said, hey, you want to give another shot? I said, I'm game if you are. And he said, okay, sir. So we took off, and then the weather was bad. Came back. Third time that day we went out, and I said, got to get back in the saddle, Chief. And we ended up flying it. Good on him for having the nads to attempt it 3 times in one day. All right. This red line is the Japanese student with a stuck throttle. I'm solo and he's solo. And the Japanese students were some of the toughest to teach. Part of it is a cultural thing where even if they don't understand what you're saying, they'll pretend that they do, because otherwise it's an insult to you, or that's how they perceive it. So there's a lot of yes sir, but you don't know if it's really yes sir I know, or yes sir I'm just saying it. So he's solo and I'm solo, and we go out here into area 1, and we're going to do the G warm-up and then the GX. G warm-up is at tactical turn, so we're a mile apart. We each do a 4G turn for 180 degrees to make sure the G suit works. And then we do another turn at 5 Gs. So we accelerate. I call 1's ready, 2's ready. We do the first turn, and he starts shooting out in front of me. I thought, what is he doing? He says, sir, my right throttle is stuck. What? I can't move it. Oh, crap. I said, okay, put the left one in idle. I'll join on you. So I'm thinking, what do I do with this kid? He's got an engine that's stuck at full power. And I thought, I may have to have him shut it off with the fuel shutoff switch. Oh, crap. His flaps are on the right generator. What if the left generator doesn't pick up the right bus? Now he's going to be single engine, no flap Japanese student. Oh, that's a disaster. Oh, what am I going to do? So long story short, I had him pop the speed brake and slow down to the point that he could put some flaps down. Then I had him put the gear down. Now he's at a speed that we can work this. And I slowly dragged him back. And then he couldn't hold altitude and power with one engine at mill. And he eventually got the throttle loose. I guess he brute forced it. Most likely a pencil or something fell down in the throttle quadrant. But that was probably my most challenging EP that I had to solve from another airplane. All right, the blue line. They were my last year or so at Columbus. They repaved the center runway. It's like a typical Air Force pilot training base with 3 runways, a short one for the T6s or T37s, a long one in the middle that the T-38s took off from, and a medium length one on the outside where T-38s practiced landings. Well, the long runway was being repaved and it took forever. And it was a crosswind day. And guys were afraid to use crosswind controls. I wasn't. There was a crew chief named Fletcher. He saw me land one day when we had stiff crosswinds, and he said, "Spike, how come everyone else's right tire's worn out and yours aren't?" And I said, "Because I know what I'm doing." But guys were afraid to put in aileron into the wind and rudder to make the nose go where you want it to go, because they thought if you rotate that the jet would flip upside down. I'd prove to the students it wouldn't. Well, anyway, inevitably, somebody blew a tire on a bad crosswind day. And so now we're down to a single runway. And so the SOF comes up and says, "Attention, all 14th Flying Training Wing aircraft, single runway ops, T-38s divert to GTR," which is right here. And my student said, "All right, sir, let's get ready to go GTR." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because everyone's going there and they've only got one runway." I said, "We're going to Huntsville." "Why?" "They've got 2 runways and they got 2 parallel taxiways. So if somebody trashes both runways, I'm going to land on a taxiway." I said, "You would?" I said, "I operated off of a taxiway in an F4 for a year in Turkey because the runway was being paved. If the wing commander asks me why I landed on a taxiway, I'll say because it was the safest thing to do." So anyway, that's what the blue line is. I contacted departure and they said, "You're blah, blah." I said, "No, I'm going to Huntsville VFR." And then to prove the point, did an extra pattern when we got there. We got the FBO car. We drove to a German restaurant, had a great lunch. And everyone else said, "Well, shit, next time I'm going to Huntsville with Spike." Let's see. Let's talk some oopsies. That is a Beale T-38 that apparently forgot to put his gear down a year and a half ago.
Wow.
I never did hear the full story, but must not have been good. That is either a Tyndall or a Langley T-38 that hit a bird and the front canopy is gone. This was a solo student, Nathan Blatt. And this is the end of runway 13 left at Columbus. And it looks like his jet's 90 degrees out. I mean, the normal way to taxi clear is over here to the right. When he was full stopping, he either blew a tire or something, but the jet did a right 270 while sliding down the runway. How this thing didn't flip over, I'll never know. But no, he didn't turn 90 left. He turned 270 right and ended up in that position.
Wow.
I know. It's pretty astonishing. All right, this was me with a Japanese student. We were taxiing out. This is right before I retired. Had an IP solo wingman behind us. We get just about to end of runway for quick check. Bang! Japanese student says, "So what happened?" I said, "Gosh, we blew a tire." About that time, I see our tire go rolling past us. Our wingman says, "Hey, you blew a tire." I said, "Yeah, thanks. I couldn't have figured that out." Well, here we are after I picked up the tire and this metal ring. You see the gear door here, Steve?
Yeah.
It should be right here. It bent the door when this tire came apart about 30 degrees. Let me show you why it happened. Here's a little O-ring that's supposed to seal it. These are nuts. There's the lugs, how the tire is bolted together. If you note, well, that's a long stud, long, and that's short, short, short. Somebody forgot to tighten the nuts, and a couple of them came off. So then one broke, and another one broke, and another one broke until the whole tire just blew itself off the rim and bent the door.
Oh.
That was pretty astonishing. I think this is Fort Worth. This is a Navy test pilot school, T-38, that flew through hail. Oops. Kind of beat it up.
Wow.
In fact, the J85 engines in the 38, the front stages are kind of thin. I've taken birds down the intake twice, a tire down the intake once, and it always destroyed the engine.
So you were, was this a formation takeoff? You were in trail?
No, it was a no flap touch and go. The tire shredded itself and a piece flew forward and came in the intake.
Wow.
Yeah. They always said it could happen. I didn't believe it could, but that happened about 3 months before I retired. Anyway, this was a two ship of Navy test pilot school 38s, and they trashed both airplanes appreciably. This was a jet at Columbus that had an engine fire, and they got it back on the ground and then stripped it apart, and they thought they were going to scrap it. But the last I heard was they loaded it on a trailer and took it to Randolph. So I guess they were going to rebuild it. That happened after I left. That's my friend Matt Ellis that took all the cool aviation pictures. That's at Navy Pensacola with a bunch of jets getting ready to go. That's Gulick's first name. Anyway, this student, Gulick, he ended up flying F-22s. That's what it looks like in flight. And there he is mission planning somewhere. That was Fango's Fini flight, and I was flying with him, and that's Beaker getting ready at the step desk. He was non-current because he had just done a thing in Afghanistan, so I had to sit in the front. But I got some cool pictures of some formation stuff. Here's a picture of what the HUD looks like, and now you get a good view of that double paned HUD and this weird bezel that kind of got in the way. That's what the control panel looked like when it was powered, and you can see the engine gauges. Some more pictures by Matt at night at Alexandria. Let me go back one. That's somebody just took off in burner. That's what that bright light over there is. Here's a Vance jet that's painted in a commemorative paint scheme, kind of like, you know, from the 1920s or 30s. That's me with Johnny Reyes at Alex. He flew A-10s. 452 was my jet, and it was getting stripped for paint. It had my name on it. This will come up in a second. Pick. All right, this is a great tire story. So I had a kid, Chris Ross, during 2009 when assignments were terrible, and he got a Predator, and he was crestfallen. But the Air Force held good to their promise, and 3 or 4 years later, they sent him back for requal in the 38, and he got a B1. So I took him cross country, and I said, we're going to get a lot of landings and a lot of approaches. And so we did. And he could tell you the exact number, but I think we got 47 landings and another 20 approaches where we'd take it down to just a foot. And I'd make them just hold it there and hover over the runway at a foot and then climb out. And we were taxiing back in at Columbus. And the way you can tell when a tire's getting worn out, you'd get white cord that would show through the tire and another layer of white cord. But when you got to the red cord, you were getting done. And if you saw any red cord on pre-flight, you couldn't take it. Well, we were taxiing in, and it must have been March because I've got a mustache, and I never had a mustache. And he said, man, I can't believe how many approaches and landings we got. And I'm beaming. He goes, yeah, look what I did. We get right in front of the control tower. Boom! Right tire blows. Mission complete. And so he took this picture for me. Oh, by the way, that's that hinge I was telling you about back when the gear door used to be an aerodynamic surface, and it would help lift the thing.
Yeah.
Some more pictures by Matt at Alexandria. Well, there came a day when they said I had to retire. And I said, but I don't want to. Well, you have to. And I even had a 4-star general go to bat for me. And chief of staff told him no. So I decided I wanted to kind of leave my mark and say thanks. So I got this T-38 kit and built this 7-foot model. It took me 9 months. I'd put in a full 12-hour day in the squadron. Then I built this in a buddy's garage. I'd work 3 or 4 hours a night and then collapse in bed around midnight. I wired it for lights. So, you know, the burner on the T-38 looks bluish purple. That's what it looked like when it was dark. And that's what it looked like when it was finished.
Wow.
When I had it professionally painted, and this was the night I hung it up in the squadron in secret, Friday after everyone went home. And when guys came in on Monday morning, I just played dumb. I was at my desk. Students came in, sir, did you see that 38? I said, I know, I built it. And then they were flabbergasted. So that's why it's got 452 on it. It had my name on the front, my wife's name on the back, my daughter's name on the other side, and that I had 4,100 hours in the 38. And that's what she looked like there. You can see the lights. There you can see the lights.
Cool.
Unfortunately, I think they've kind of dicked it up now, and it's who knows what's going to happen to it. The 50th is closing. I would hope that it would go to the 49th, but I don't know. They moved it. The lights don't work anymore. They screwed up the pitot tube on it. I could go on, but they kind of pissed me off. So it is most guys when they're doing their Fini flight will go up with their fellow IPs and just screw around and have fun. And I said, you know, I came here to teach. I'm going to teach. So this was in the morning on my last day. I led a formation flight solo. Here's crew chief. I wore my Phantom patch just because, and my 4,000 hour 38 patch. It's getting ready to taxi. You can see both the patches there. That's me leading the takeoff. Matt was out in the RSU getting the pictures. But for my very last flight, I did a kid's first flight. So his dad flew the F4. I flew the F4. His dad was a United captain. I was a United first officer. And I said, what could be more poetic than his first flight and my last flight? So that's what I did. Here I am showing them how to get properly strapped into the airplane. And I hand walked him through 5 landings on his dollar ride. And I was going to give him all. And he said, no, sir, you take the last one. So Matt was out in the RSU. And this is me moments before touchdown on my very last landing in an Air Force jet. There we are after touchdown. The hose down. These two guys. There's Ryan that you saw earlier and Screech. They both flew the A-10. They were in 2 different classes, but they ended up in Afghanistan flying a mission together. And they got called into a troops in contact that Pong said it was a no kidding troops in contact. There was a convoy trapped on the side of a mountain and with 60 some people in it, and that had been stuck there all night. And the Taliban had snuck down through the trees at night and were now close enough they were throwing hand grenades. These guys shot every bullet they had. And when the Taliban finally started to flee, then they started bombing them. Everybody in the convoy lived. They killed, I think, at least 18 bad guys. And they sent me that flag. And Pong, he basically emailed me from Afghanistan, said, well, you don't have a secure telephone, but we said, if it hadn't been for you, we wouldn't have been there. Sorry. Still kind of gets me. So anyway, I was that morning, my computer would always lock up and my back faced the door to the room. And I was swearing at the computer because I couldn't log in to check grade sheets. And I hear a voice behind me say, there he is, swearing at the computer again. I turn around. Both these guys got permission to bring A-10s to Columbus for my retirement on a Wednesday. That's unheard of.
Wow.
So it was quite the honor. There we are out at the jet after I got hosed down. Conrad's a great student, great friend. My brothers, one of my grandkids. I played my own national anthem for my retirement. And that's the 38. And I love flying the White Rocket, and it's still one of the greatest loves of my life. I missed some of the stories. I could go back, but I've probably already dragged it out long enough.
Oh, there's been no dragging. This is, if you want to go through them, go through them.
Well, let me see. Let me find the list. Hang on a second. I've got it on the other computer here. Let's see. Yeah, we got that. Oh, let's see. I threw in a bunch of suggestions to try to modify the airplane. I had an air conditioning mod, but they always kept saying the same thing. The jet's going to be gone in 10 years. Well, it's been 15 years since my first suggestion. They could have modified the leading edge relatively easy, put a conical camber on it. You were talking about area drag rule. Nobody understood aerodynamic washout back then. You know how if you look head on at an F-16 or an Eagle wing, it looks like the wing rolls down as you go out and span.
Cambered. Yeah.
If they did that in the 38, it wouldn't have the crappy stall characteristics it does. I wondered, why don't they put an F5 wing on it with the maneuvering flap? Answer, because some guy patented that idea, and so it would cost the Air Force a fortune to put an F5 wing on it. T-38 bases had this barrier system, basically kind of like the barrier they use on an aircraft carrier when the cables don't work. But it would have been so much better if the airplane had a tail hook, because there were only about 6 airports in the United States that have a barrier, but there's probably 100 that have cables. Let's see. Oh, I forgot. I was going to talk about the weight and balance on the C model. The first 2 airplanes that they modified from T-38A to C were actually AT-38Bs. And the B had 50 pounds of lead in the tail. Why? Because of the bomb pod. Well, when they put the first C model on the scales, they said, oh my God, this airplane's tail heavy. So they put weight in the nose gear well. And it's still there to this day.
No way.
Dumbasses.
No way.
There's a piece of lead in the tail of those first 2 jets. And so it was really noticeable to a guy that flew the A model. There was less nose authority in the C because there was this 50-pound piece of steel bolted into the nose gear well. There's other stories about that too. Talked about the PMP thing. The intake redesign, besides causing compressor stalls, it was noisy. When the intake angled down, engine noise bounced off the upper side of the intake and went away from the rear cockpit. Now it reflected off the bottom, and it was noisy, way noisier than the A. Let's see. Okay, talked about that. VFR legs. So one of the things that the students had to do was fly a VFR leg. And what most of the other guys would do is they'd file an IFR flight plan, climb up, cancel, and fly at, 16,000 feet. I said, what's that? I wouldn't let them do that. I said, we're going to file VFR and fly VFR, and we're not going above 3,000 feet. And so we would take off, say from Tallahassee, do some patterns at Tyndall, and then fly down the beach until we got to Pensacola and beat up the pattern. And guys would say, well, you're not going to get any range. You're not going high. I said, au contraire. When you climb to altitude, you're in mill power for 10 or 15 minutes. We're only in mill power for 1 or 2 minutes. We don't get as good a mileage at 3,000 feet, but we didn't piss away a lot of gas in the climb. And so guys were always astonished we could fly this VFR leg at 3,000 feet and get 12 landings and an hour and 15 minutes sometimes. They said, how are you doing that? I said, it's science. It's all done with mirrors. All right, I told you about the Japanese throttle guy. Saudi gearbox failure. This was actually, he was a good student, and we had done an out and back up to the mountains in Knoxville. And we were almost home. I said, all right, let's do a formation low approach, because they weren't allowed to do formation landings when they were solo. And then you'll get a closed pattern land, and then I'll land. Well, as we're on the formation low approach, he says, sir, I have a generator failure. I said, uh-oh. He says, no, they have hydraulic failure. I said, oh, crap, he's got gearbox failure. So he can't retract his gear. And I said, I got to get this guy on the ground. So I talked him around. I had to tell the controllers what was going on and massage the pattern a little bit. I talked about that one. Musa. Had a student from Nigeria, and he was kind of struggling. And they said, all right, Spike, you've got to take Musa cross country. And I said, okay. And I asked him, I said, what do you think the hardest part of flying an instrument sortie is? And of course, he probably talked about climb. I said, no, it's the last 15 minutes. It's getting the right approach plate on your leg. It's understanding what you need to do. It's making sure you have the right nav aids tuned in so that you're ready. And so on a typical instrument ride, the IP would take them up, they'd climb, they'd drop into one airport, do one approach, climb out, go to another airport and land. 2 approaches. I said, oh no. We took off and dropped in to, it was either 3 or 4 different airports. I never let them go any faster than 240 knots. And we never went any farther than 50 miles between airports. Now, 240 doesn't sound fast in a T-38, but when you only got 50 miles to get ready, you're busier than a one-legged man at an ass-kicking contest. And so now he got 5 instrument approaches in one ride. And so we flew the whole weekend like that. We came back and flight commander said, how'd he do? And I said, his instruments are awesome. He said, you're kidding me. I said, no. I said, his front seat landings in unfamiliar airports aren't that great. I said, his instrument work is solid. He said, is he ready for check? I said, I think so. So when kids would go for their check ride, they'd come back in. They'd always tell them, you've got an excellent in everything unless you get a downgrade. And so guys would say, all right, I got a good overall with 6 downgrades. And the ideal would be an excellent with no downgrades. So Musa comes back in at the end of the day, and he's got this real solemn poker face. And someone says, how'd you do? And he finally cracks a smile. He got an excellent with 1 downgrade. And my fellow IPs are looking at, how the hell did you do that? I said, all in a day's work. So I think it was a year and a half ago. He's now a lieutenant colonel in the Nigerian Air Force and was going through Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base. And he said, he called me up, said, I want to come down and visit you. We'll go to the museum at Pensacola, and I've got my family with me. I said, awesome. So I met him at the museum and showed him around, talked airplanes. There's even a T-38 there. And when they were saying goodbye, he said, the museum was just the excuse. I really wanted my family to meet you. Wow. that got me.
What
Let's see.
what's he
Go ahead.
flying, Spike? What was he flying?
Initially, he was flying the Chinese built MiG-21,
Okay.
and more recently, he's flying some kind of turboprop trainer for them.
Okay.
Let's see. I was on an out and back to Gulfport, Mississippi, and while I was there, I ran into an F4 guy that I knew from Spangdahlem. He was in another squadron at Spang, but he'd gone to test pilot school, and I was trying to go. I never got to, but he was giving me advice on how to fill out the package. His name's Paul Lockhart, and he flew the shuttle twice. So we see each other. Hey, how's it going? We're having a grand old time. And he was flying a 38 with another NASA guy. And so it was time for him to go out to the airplane and us too. And so as we're walking out to the airplanes, I started singing the Wild Weasel song, which is quite profane. And he joins in. And next thing you know, we are screaming it at the top of our lungs. And when we finish the song, we're laughing, we're high-fiving, doing the bro hug. And as he goes one way to his jet, I go my way to mine. I said to my student, I said, I'll bet you never expected to see me singing a dirty fighter pilot song with an astronaut today. And he said, sir, I've learned not to discount anything with you. Let's see. I talked about Temple's bottle.
Hey, Spike, stop
Yes.
stop sharing so that
Okay, sure.
Because I don't know if the viewers can see us because we never figured out whether or not we were recording
Okay.
our faces. There we go. Okay, so now they can see. Okay.
Very good. Now we know. I talked about Temple's bottle, the one, at Spike's room. And so I got invited to his weapons school graduation, and to another guy. Temple was going through F-16 weapons school, and the other guy, John Breeze, was going through F-35. So it just happened that they were both graduating the same day. And I decided to go. And my wife said, you're going to have so much fun. I said, I've been retired for 5 years. I said, I'll know those two guys, maybe a couple others. I said, but I'm yesterday's news. Nobody's going to know me. Well, I'd never been to a weapons school graduation before, and I didn't know. Basically, anyone that's ever been to weapons school is invited to those parties. And I said, you know what? I had an airline trip the next day, so I thought I'm going to go for a few hours and then I'll beat it. But I'm going to bring a flight suit. I thought, what are they going to do? Make me retire again for impersonating an active duty officer? So I airlined in, I rented a car, drove to Nellis, switched it in my bag. I'm sitting around just hanging out in the club. And the party was going to start in another hour. And a couple guys came in and said, Spike. And hey. And a little bit later, a couple more guys. I said, wow. So anyway, long story short, I don't know how many people were at this party, but there's probably 200 or 300. And my estimation is I probably flew with at least 300 different students at Columbus. There's about, about 4,000 fighter pilots in the Air Force. So I said, hell, if you had 9 more of me, I could have trained every fighter pilot. So anyway, long story short, I probably ran into 30 of my old students at this weapons school party. I said, and those are the guys that made the party. I said, that's 10% of the guys that I taught. So I asked another guy, another old student who's a F-16 squadron commander now. I said, is that typical? I said, 10% of my students would go to weapons school and another 5% have gone to TPS. He said, dude, you're hitting way above average. I said, well, all right. That was really cool. So long story short, I ended up staying until 1 a.m. and finally dragged my butt back to the Vegas airport so I could get back to Houston to fly my trip. Here's a great story. Got a student, Taylor, still good friends. Awesome officer, extremely intelligent, super motivated, but he kept throwing up in the airplane. And if you throw up, you bust the ride. Bust too many rides, you're out. So he was only authorized to fly with 3 guys, and I wasn't one of them. Well, one day they were short of IPs, and so they said, Spike, you got to fly with him. And if he pukes, you bust him. Okay. So I gave him my standard story. I said, how many sphincters in the human body? I said, besides the obvious one. I said, a sphincter is a circular muscle. These things around your nose, your mouth, the iris of your eyes, the obvious one, and there's a couple others. I said, but there's one at the top of your stomach and there's one at the bottom of your stomach. I said, my brother calls his stomach his eating muscle. I said, what happens to any muscle when it gets tired? He said, it gives up. I said, yeah, we're going to work on your eating muscle. I said, how much does your food weigh as an adult man and you eat a normal meal? He said, I don't know, a pound? I said, that's about right. I said, so if you're pulling 5 Gs, he said, it weighs 5 pounds. I said, now he's motivated. And so I did things differently. Other guys would go out and start with a 5G maneuver first thing when the jet could only pull 5.5. And if the guy pulled 5.6, now he's over G'd the jet. I said, no, we'll start with a 1G maneuver. Then we'll do a 2, then a 3. Then we'll do the G warm up at 4 Gs. And then we'll do the GX at 5. And we're kind of building your tolerance. We're losing fuel weight. And you're learning how to gauge your hand. Okay. So we go out there and do a few maneuvers. He says, sir, can you take the jet? Yeah. I look out the side of the airplane. I hear, I looked, he said, all right, sir, I'm ready to go back. I said, why? He said, I threw up. I said, I didn't see anything. I said, you think you're getting off that easy? Hell no. Now he's motivated. So we do some more maneuvers. I think I had to do it another time. And now he gets to actually fly in the pattern for the first time in weeks. Because other times when he puked, I puked, take the jet, take him home. Get back in the building. Flight commander says, how'd he do? I said, he actually did really good. He said, did he puke? And I said, I didn't see anything, which is true. Next time I took him up, he only puked once. Next time he went up, he didn't puke at all. Anyway, he ended up getting an F-16. Now he flies for Delta.
Very nice.
When guys were almost done, if they were getting a fighter, there was a ride that was called an advanced handling ride, AHC. And I'd say, when you do a loop, how long are you doing 5 Gs? He said, I don't know. I said, about 12 seconds. And then the G starts to bleed up. I said, what's corner velocity? And it's like, 390 knots, sir. Mm-hmm. What kind of G can you sustain? Oh, 5 Gs. No, you can barely hold 3.5. Really? Yeah. I said, how about if we do a sideways loop? I said, what's that? We're going to get 500 knots, like we're going to do a loop, but then we're just going to go into a level turn at 500 knots at 5 Gs. He said, is that legal? I said, is there anything in the book that says you can only turn at 1 bank and 1 G? Well, no. I said, then we're going to do it. So I take them out there, and before they modified the intakes, you could do this in mil power. You'd get 500 knots, blend up to 5 Gs, and then they'd find out, oh shit, this is a lot harder than doing a loop because I'm holding 5 Gs until we run out of gas. And then I'd make them talk to approach control while pulling 5 Gs to request their recovery. I said, you want to be a fighter pilot? You're going to have to learn how to talk on the radio and do an anti-G straining maneuver at the same time.
Wow.
So I did that with Conrad that you saw the picture earlier. And we got back into the squadron and someone said, hey, what were you guys doing when I heard you on the radio? I said, about 5 Gs. Those are fun. Burner climbs. Guys like to do a burner climb on an out and back because they thought, oh, I'm going to get away with something here. So they keep it in burner after they got the gear and flaps up. They'd cheat. Instead of climbing at 300 knots, which was authorized, they'd get about 330 and they'd do a quick zoom climb and the thing would run out of steam within about 2,000 feet. So I was flying with Felon on my wing. He's another good friend that I just actually heard from just yesterday. And I said, no, there's a way better way. What are we going to do? So we'd get to 10,000 feet. We're in tactical, so a mile apart. And we'd get about 400 indicated, because now we can go faster than the standard speed limit. And then we'd ask for a quick climb to say 25,000 feet. I say, burner now. And up we go. And every guy I ever taught this to, when we'd get down on the ground, they'd say, dude, how the hell did that work? I said, simple. You got 330 knots on the deck. Yeah, you got more thrust, but most of that climb is just inertia. But when you're doing 400 indicated at 10,000 feet, your true airspeed is actually about 480. And so now you've got way more inertia at 480 than you did at 330, because everybody be going, oh my God, I want to roll inverted to stop the climb, but I'm not supposed to do that when I'm in Class A airspace. It was impressive. It really was. See, I talked about the divert to Huntsville. Okay. Well, you know, the biggest complaint about the 38, I have two. The air conditioner was terrible in the summer. And because they designed it to go supersonic, which ironically is no longer even in the syllabus, it turns terribly. The turn circles are gigantic. The loop takes 8,000 feet of vertical. So I was with a kid, and I liked to teach them. They only knew two descent profiles: 80% power and 5 degrees nose low, or idle and 7. I said, you can descend any way you want. So I had this kid, we were going idle and about 60 degrees nose low. And we're above 10,000 feet, so we're hauling ass. And we were over some farmland in Nebraska, and from the back I said, raise the nose a degree or two. Sir? Raise the nose a degree or two. Why? We're supersonic. Why are you whispering? I don't want anyone to know. So no kidding, at least twice I can think of cross countries where we did an idle descent and the jet was supersonic and idle. That's a pretty slick airplane. Last cross country. So I used to come to Pensacola quite a bit on cross country. The guys there in the transient line were awesome. They knew me, they knew my family. And I was flying with a Saudi kid that was actually quite good. And it was the last day. So the first 2 days, I'm trying to beat my techniques into him. But on the last day, I just leave him alone, see what he can do on his own. So he's on the computer working on flight planning. And there was a Navy Growler parked out on the flight line. I'm sitting in the transient shack. The flight line door opens up. I see this Navy 05 open the door. He kind of gives me the wave. I give him the wave. Then he smiles. He starts walking towards me. I said, that guy's coming over here to talk to me. So I stand up, meet him halfway across the room, said, hey, Bruce Benyshek, Spike. He said, I know. You gave me my first ride here in the T-34. I said, so it was full circle. This guy, as an 01 ensign in nav school, I'd given him his first ride in the T-34. He was now the squadron commander at Whidbey Island. And here I am a month away from retiring. I said, you know what? The cycle is complete. That's really cool. Same Saudi student. We were in a van going to where we were going to sleep for the night. And it's supposed to be a round of drinks if somebody's cell phone rings during the debrief. Okay. Special dispensation for the Sauds. I don't know who his dad was, but his dad was somebody way up, either in the military or in the royal family. And so his cell phone rings while we're in the van. He said, I am sorry, sir. I said, you can get it. He said, no, sir, it's okay. I said, you can get it. Okay. So he gets on the phone. And he says, my father says, thank you very much, sir. and that he very much appreciates it. So tell him I said thank you. He says if there is anything he can do for you, just to let him know. I said, tell him your Air Force has some F5s they aren't using anymore. And he laughed. And he went, he says you couldn't afford it. I said, tell him I'm only going to fly it 2 or 3 times a year. Oh, I hoped for so long, but nothing happened. Let's see. Talked about that. So when I got 4,000 hours in the jet, that was about 3 months before I retired. They did a little write-up on me in the base paper. And I don't know, a few days later, the 4-star that ran Air Training Command was visiting the base. I was supposed to go out into the RSU, and I get a phone call, said, Spike, you hear about the general? No. He says he's got to meet the guy with 4,000 hours in a T-38. Be at base ops at 1 o'clock. Oh, crap. I got to get a haircut. So I get out of RSU duty. I go to base ops. I'm waiting there. Here comes the big white bus. Here comes General Rand, followed by a whole bunch of 06s and a whole bunch of 05s. And he strides right up to me, shakes my hand, and we're talking airplanes. And his executive officer is a major that was an old student of mine. and he said, Sir, Colonel Benyshek taught me everything I know about flying. I think, keep spooning it, Schulman. And so Rand gives me his coin and he says, if there's anything I can ever do for you. And I thought, well, I'd already asked for it 1 more year and been turned down. I said, well, I asked for another year and they said no. And he said, I heard about that. I said, anything you can do? He said, I can't promise anything. Let me look into it. And I thought for a week he was going to convince the chief of staff to let me stay 1 more year, but they said no. Well, a couple of days later, I had to go to some staff meeting, and everyone's going around the room, and their finishing slide says, be like Spike. And everyone laughed. Okay, next guy, his last slide says, be more like Spike. I thought, okay, very funny. What is this? Well, I found out after Rand had a company grade officers luncheon at the O Club and was going on and on about service before self and all this other stuff. And we need more people to be like Spike. And so I was a butt of jokes for a couple of weeks, be more like Spike. But yeah, it was all right. All right.
Who was the chief of staff at that time?
I can't think. He was an A-10 guy.
Okay. So when did you retire?
2014.
Yeah, I don't know.
The rationale was, well, why would we let him stay when we're paying other lieutenant colonels to go away? Okay.
Maybe the 4,000 hours.
Yeah.
15 years
anyway,
experience.
So I think it's been 11 years, and there's things about the 767 where I go, I flew that just 5 years ago. I can barely remember it. And I'll bet you I probably wouldn't pass all the questions, about rules and stuff, but I'll bet you if you just parked me in the 38 airplane and had me fly it, I could probably still pass a check ride. Probably.
But I'm butting up against my time limit, so I wanted to.
Yes, sir.
I know you've got more stories, but I wanted to get some.
No, that's actually all of them.
Oh well, there we go. Perfect timing. Let me, if you would, stay with me for another sort of 10-15 minutes. Let me just ask you some questions.
Sure thing.
So the first question that I've been thinking of, throughout this conversation is, well, not conversation, throughout your presentation, is how passionate you are clearly about your students, about going the extra mile, thinking differently, applying your engineering brain to problems to find solutions, and doing it differently to everybody else. And so I get a huge amount of passion, a huge amount of pride, and obviously satisfaction, and just doing the right thing for the student. So I understand that, but the question in my mind is, while you're accruing these 4.5 or 4,100 hours in the T-38, are you pining to go back to a gray jet? Are you thinking, you know,
No,
you're not?
I mean, it would have been nice, but I also knew, well, first off, that wasn't even an option. And I enjoyed what I was doing so much that it really didn't matter. It was almost like flying a fighter. And here's part of that motivation and passion. Um, I would always approach teaching a student this way. I said, I know that I know what they need to know. How do I present it in a way that they'll understand it? And I watched other guys that just, they all, this guy would say it the same way, this guy would say it the same way. And it's obvious the student's going, I don't get it. Here, I'll give you an example. I'll say I had a student, even though I actually never flew with him, but he came over and I chair flew with him a bunch. He got hired at United a couple of years ago, and he asked me to pin his wings on at the winging ceremony. Actually, two of my students got hired that same day. And after the winging ceremony, he invited me to lunch with his parents, and he was there with a buddy that flew F-16s, and he told his buddy, he said, Colonel Benyshek taught me how to land the T-38, even though we actually never flew in the jet. And his buddy went, what? Yeah. I would show them. Here's the example. I'd say, grab my hand, okay. Show me how hard you think you're going to have to pull to fully flare this jet. And they always did the same thing. They'd pull about 5 or 6 pounds. I said, no, it can take this much. The only reason I knew is the simulator used to show stick force gradient readout. It can take anywhere from 12 to 20 pounds, depending on how the guys got it trimmed, to fully flare it. So they weren't used to those kinds of stick forces. It was also the first airplane they'd flown where the controls were not direct cable. You're just moving a hydraulic valve. And so you're literally fighting a garage door spring. You're not feeling air load on the tail. And so I said, the farther you move it, the heavier it's going to get. And you need more movement, not a familiar stick force. And so, yeah, anyway, it was always my quest to say, okay, I'd say this. How would I live with myself if somebody died in combat or an accident because there was something I could have taught them and didn't?
Speaking of which, then you mentioned guys going to formerly called Lift and now IFS, as you described. So you know that your top students are going to go to that program if they get picked up for fighters, and
Right.
and obviously
Right.
that varies. You mentioned a guy got Predator and so on. So that's not a given. But when you're in this position, then as somebody who is thinking very analytically about training, who's thinking in a very sort of considered way about their student. They're not just a number. They're not just somebody going through the pipeline. It's not a sausage factory, whatever. Is it difficult for you to, or was it difficult for you to sort of compartmentalize the flying training bit from preparing them for IFF? I mean, it sounds like a weird question, but what I'm saying is, you talked about the advanced handling ride that you gave them, and you changed the way that was performed so that they actually got more from it than they would have done if, let's say,
So okay, so I think I know your question. There were certain constraints. We were only able to teach them certain things. I would color all the way to the edge. Other guys were in the middle. So that the 500 knots, I called it a sideways loop, but it was just literally a 500 knot level turn. I thought, you want to ground me for that? Show me the justification. You can't. Anything I could legally show them that was away from the cut and ordinary that everyone else was doing, I did. And I think that's why I was frequently voted favorite instructor, because I tried to show them the full spectrum. I tried to make it an easier transition to IFF than basically it was introducing some of the same ideas as far as I could go.
Tell us a little then about the psychology of students washing out then. So if you have this approach where you're doing everything you can and you are taking personal responsibility for it and you own it, how difficult is it then to see somebody wash out and for you to know that ultimately you were not successful in progressing them?
I only had one that I can think of. There might have been two guys that I could not teach to land that airplane. And that happened right at the end. And I thought, I can teach anybody to land this thing. And this kid couldn't do it. He ended up flying Preds and has made a good career for himself in the Air Force, but he just couldn't master the 38. I was probably more emotionally attached than most. I didn't bust a lot of students. I had tried to show them the light so they could get through it on their own. But there is that aspect where you have to say, this guy's not going to cut it. Okay, I'll give you an example. Had a kid that was supposed to go to an F-22, and I never got to fly with him until the end on an AHC ride. And he had a lot of flying time. He was a guard guy, but it was airline time, and so it's straight and level. What do you think? What do you think? And so what I tried to do on that ride with him, I said, I want you to do every aerobatic maneuver that we can do. And I'm giving you a maximum of 5 seconds from the time you exit one maneuver until you're setting up for the next. No drone time. It's just go, 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 go. And he couldn't do it. And I thought, man, he's going to have a tough time in IFF. And sure enough, he didn't make it. So I kind of saw that one coming. And maybe I could have made a difference if I'd been allowed to fly with him sooner. Don't know. But yeah, that's tough. And he got a different assignment, and he's made a good career for himself too. So
4,100 hours then. I'm curious to know what that translates into in terms of your capacity, your cognitive capacity in the aeroplane. When you've got that many hours, is everything done in your mind on autopilot? Are you thinking about switch positioning? Are you thinking about programming? Are you thinking about flying? Are you thinking about runway headings?
okay.
What does that translate into then? I mean, do you just saunter up to the airplane?
All right. So I used to ask my students, when you first learn to ride a bike, it took everything you knew to not crash. And yet still, when you saw a telephone pole, you'd be drawn to it like a magnet. I said, yet by the time you were in high school, you're riding no hands with your bud and talking about girls and stuff. You didn't even think about it, right? Okay. I said, that's what flying fighters is like. You don't think about flying the airplane. You're thinking about riding the bike while carrying a gun and shooting at bad guys. And they said, wow. I said, the flying's just natural. You don't have to think about it. And so the 38 was that way. I forgot to talk about my fuel adder. I came up with a very simple way to calculate how much gas it took to go from one place to the other, including if you changed altitudes. Like you said, man, we got a terrible headwind here, and how to adjust for it. And it just came from studying the data in the flight manual, and I wanted some simple rules of thumb. So I started teaching it, and then they came up with a fuel diversion computer in the C model. And guess what? All my stuff was perfect. They said, how did you do that? I said, I made a table and rounded off the numbers. It's easy to do. Anyway, damn, what was the question? that you said up there? Thinking about what to do in the jet. So I would be thinking about, all right, we got this many miles to go. It's going to cost this much gas. He's got these events to get done. That's going to cost this much gas. That. So it was time management, fuel management, event management, mostly. And if things went wrong, maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, take the appropriate action. Like they beat into us from even when I was a student.
Tell me then about the most frightening or scary experience that you've been subjected to by a student. Then in that many hours, there must have been some times when
I was brand new to the jet, maybe the first year, and the kid was doing a no flap. Okay, the no flap is 15 knots faster than the full flap one. And guys misunderstand it. It's actually more slippery than a full flap until you get about 5 knots below approach speed, and then it's about the same drag. And if you get 10 knots below, then it gets really draggy. Well, this kid was flying down final, and he's 10 knots slow, 10 knots slow, 10 knots slow. And I said, airspeed. He went to idle. I went, Jesus Christ. And we were only about 100 feet. And I had it in blower, and I had the nose jacked as high as it would go. And all I see is ground rush in my peripheral vision. And I thought, the tail's going to hit the ground first. The fuselage is going to buckle, and we're going to turn into a fireball. Well, we got into ground effect. The wheels touched down. Now we're in burner, hauling ass down the runway, lifted off again. So that gave rise to me saying, say what you mean and mean what you say. So another example, a student we're taxiing in an unfamiliar airfield, and he said, should I turn left here, sir? I previously would have said, right, because no, the other one. So then I would say, correct.
Did you come up with any other sayings or sort of mantras or similar things?
Yes.
Then what else did you come up with?
Let's see. Hang on, I got to think about it. Well, let's see. This was more of a style. I was known for my off-color and irreverent humor. And I would say, if I can teach you something and it's funny, you will never forget it. And it's true. It's just like teaching kids the alphabet with a song. So if you associate learning with music, that gets cemented into a part of your brain that's hard to lose. And I don't know how far I should go with some of these jokes, but I would use irreverent, profane humor. And well, here, that's John Wasaki. That's their class patch. It says pilot when it's right side up, and it says beer when it's upside down. But I was flying a pattern ride with him, and he's incomplete flaring it. Wham! I said, don't be you can imagine what I said. And said, make this thing your bitch. So next time around, he says, I'll show him. I said, nice. I said, now tell her to make you a sandwich. So he laughs, he comes around again. It's really nice. I said, even better. Tell her to put cheese on it this time. So that's why this picture is Androcles and the lion, except he's holding a Philly cheesesteak sandwich in his hand. And he understood how to flare the jet after that ride.
I remember when we talked, I think that the tape wasn't running. but we talked. It must have been after the OV10 stuff because that was our most recent conversation.
Mhm.
And we were talking about doing the T-38 thing, and I think I asked you what you did for your Fini ride, and you told me you'd done a regular teaching sortie, which I thought was sort of quite remarkable, really, given as you just said 30 minutes ago, you could have just gone up and done some BFM against the other guys, or whatever. But I wanted to understand how, or I wanted to hear about how you felt about that sortie and how you approached it in the weeks leading up to it, because you know it's going to happen, don't you? I mean, you know
Mhm.
they're scheduling it, and you've been told you've
Yep.
got a car anyway. So, um, I mean, do you sort of think about that a lot? Were you
It
concerned
was
about it?
very fulfilling. It was
Yeah,
very fulfilling. I did 31 years and 4 months in the Air Force. And other than the 1 year I was waiting to go to Pitt to T-38 training, I flew my entire career.
crazy.
And so when I looked at it, I said, well, yeah, this chapter's closing. God damn, I had the longest freaking, it was War and Peace.
Yeah.
I mean, what a book. Um, the
Did it make you sad?
No, I mean, well, a little wistful, but it was more a case of feeling proud of what I'd done. And because there's still guys that tell me, I wouldn't have got through pilot training without you,
Hmm.
and that have had very successful careers. And that means a ton.
How do you go from that then to being an airline pilot? What sort of adjustment
Well,
does it take?
it's a different kind of flying and different kind of fun. Okay, so um, in the 38, I prided myself in the ability to teach, where guys I could, I'd say, this kid has heard this speech from 7 different IPs and doesn't get it. I'm going to present it in a different way where it makes a difference. And I frequently did. Um, I was guys would, some of the IPs say, Spike, how the hell do you make gas? I said, what do you mean? He said, you get more stuff done in one sortie than anyone else. I said, simple. I don't just leave the throttles at mill if there's no reason for them to be there. I'm always looking for a reason to throttle back and save the gas. So I prided myself in the ability to reach the students, um, in getting more training done per sortie than anyone else, um, and being really good at it. I mean, I got 3 check rides where I got exceptionally qualified, an EQ. That's the highest rating you can get on a check ride. Um, and I must be doing something right. So there was just basically pride of accomplishment, and knowing that I set so many guys up for their future careers. Now in the airline biz, it was okay. Let me see if I can beat the time on the flight plan and burn less gas and get a smooth landing. And oftentimes they could. I mean, a smooth landing 7.6 was one of the easiest to land that there is. Um, there were times where I wasn't even sure we were on the ground, and I said, can I relax the back? Oh wait, I just saw the speed brake lever. We are on the ground. That was fun. That would happen about once every 2 months or so. Um, and sometimes I beat the time. Oftentimes I beat the gas, just by using kind of T-38 descent techniques. And I was always looking for a reason to throttle back if there was no reason to keep the power up.
Yeah.
So so it's a different kind of satisfaction. It's not going upside down. Okay, that's why I've got an epsilon now.
So final question then.
Sure.
You did just talk about getting EQs on check rides. How, what sort of reception did you get from IPs who are coming along to assess your instructional capabilities? So were they
It
intimidated
depends.
by your reputation and your hours and your success?
There were some guys, mostly older guys. Okay, we had some guys come in back in the they were taking guys out of retirement to be 38 IPs. And that's how I spent my last 4 years. I technically had to retire from the reserves, but they brought me back in a day later as an active duty guy for 4 more years. And there were 3 other guys like that. And they looked to me, they said, hey, teach us all the stuff that we know, we need to know that's not in the book. Then there were other guys where it's, either something, yeah, I don't want to do it his way. And then there's a lot of the younger guys that were brand new, they'd say, well, teach me stuff. So there's pride of ownership stuff where some guys would say, yeah, I'm gonna do it the book way, or nah, that's Spike's way. So there were some that liked, some that didn't. Um, 1 or 2 guys that were openly hostile because they thought Spike doesn't do it the right way. I said, it's not the wrong way. I won't name any names.
Did you have league tables then amongst the instructor cadre where you, I mean, it may be a ridiculous question, but where you talked about the weapons school graduation thing, and you may be having sort of taught 300 pilots through pilot training, and 10% of them were there at at the weapons school, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But was that a number that you ever tracked in any way? Was it a metric?
Not really. No, it was just
okay.
I started brainstorming one day saying, how many guys have I taught? And so I figured out the number of years and a rough average number of guys per class. And holy crap, that's a lot of guys.
So
Plus probably another 150 or so backseaters in the Navy. Really, no wonder I can't remember names.
It'd be interesting to see how many of the people that you taught are watching this or listening to this. I don't know. It probably will go out on Spotify as a podcast, but it won't make much sense because you're mostly pointing at pictures for most of the time that we've been talking. So,
yeah.
Spike, thank you so much for coming back on the channel. It's
it's always my pleasure, Steve.
It's been a joy. Thank you so much, and you put a lot of effort into doing the prep. I remember when we did the Bronco one. I was completely taken by surprise that you would go away and do this. I thought you were just going to turn up and we would just chat about Bronco, but you actually put together well, you're an engineer, so your engineering prowess came to the fore, and we had a structured presentation that was very interesting and really well received as well. And your F4G episodes well received too. So I'm hoping this one will be the same. It certainly deserves to be. But thank you very much. Appreciate it, Spike.
It's always my pleasure.